All right, we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 6. Last week we finished by studying verses 10 and 11. Keep in mind that there's several different categories of individuals that Solomon has under consideration. There's the wise, there's the fool, there's the poor and the rich, not necessarily any four of them equating to one another. These are four separate types of categories of people in life. And in verse 10, whatever one is, he has been named already. It doesn't matter which category we fit into, whether we're poor or rich, wise or foolish. Whatever one is, he has been named already, for it is known that he is man. We mentioned as we ended last class that this seems to be a play on the word Adama in the Hebrew, which is red dirt. Is what the Adama, the soil, red soil, which is why Adam was named Adam, because he was made from the ground. And so when Solomon references he has been named already, it is this because he is man. It is known that he is man. And this gives implication into what he's going to get into in chapter 7, when he talks about going to the house of mourning rather than the house of laughter. It's better to go to the house of mourning. But he uses this to describe the fact that it doesn't matter what social status you have, it doesn't matter where you're from or who you are, we are man. And as a result, we are by definition limited. He cannot contend, verse 10, with him who is mightier than he, and in particular, we can't contend with the one who created us. But just as Adam and Eve learned in the garden by disobeying God and eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you cannot contend with him who is mightier than us. Since there are many things that increase vanity, how is man the better? There's all kinds of, beyond just wealth and the different elements of life that Solomon's been considering really over the last 6 chapters. There are many things that can increase vanity. There's all kinds of priorities that people can place in their lives that they obsess over or that they put more importance than they should on. Does it make man any more than what he is? Is man still man? He's still dust. Okay, and that is the point of verse 11, is that there are many things that increase vanity. How is man the better? He's not. And that's the idea, that's the point. Especially in context of things that man traditionally places great deals of trust in, like wealth, money, power, influence, having people following you, listening to you, people serving you.
Looks, appearance.
Yeah, looks, appearances. Yeah, that's a good one. People who kind of cash in on what they look like to get people to do what they want them to. None of that makes you any more than what you are. We are simply flesh, and we are ultimately temporary. Verse 12, for who knows what is good for man in life, all the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow. I find that interesting that Solomon adds that in verse 12, all the days of his vain life. Under what perspective is Solomon considering life being a vain life? Under the sun. Yeah, under the sun. That's what verses 10 and 11 is about. Okay? Man he's just flesh. He's from dust. Yes, that's true. Under the sun. And this is exactly what Solomon's point is that for everything he writes to make a negative point about focusing on the physical, focusing on the flesh, there is an unspoken opposite positive point, recognizing the soul, recognizing the spirit of man, and that is truly the only thing that makes man better, verse 11. For instance, the unspoken rhetorical question is, since there are many things that increase vanity, how is man the better? Well, the same question is, since there are many things that can help us in our soul, how can that make our spirit better? Okay, that's the other side of the coin. is that man can't be, he's flesh and he's bound by flesh. He can't be increased with things under the sun. But from the soul's perspective, from God's perspective, from a spirit, man can be made better. Okay? Man can learn, he can grow, he can understand what God wants. And that's that constant balance that Solomon's bringing out between under the sun and the spirit or the soul. So verse 12, for who knows what is good for man in life, all the days of his vain life, which passes like a shadow? Again, this is under the sun. God knows what's good for man, right? But Solomon's already dealt with that. He's kind of just boiled it down to it's good to enjoy the fruits of your labors, eat and drink, and enjoy the luxuries and the pleasures that you have in this life under the sun according to God's will, because this is what God has given to us. This is our heritage, under the sun. Okay? He's already dealt with for who knows what is good for man. But really, this is the full picture that he's considering here, verse 12. Not just, well, what's good for me right now, or what's going to be good for me tomorrow. This is the full picture. Can you or I step back from ourselves and be able to anticipate, predict every decision that's going to be the best thing for us all the way through to the end of our life? Can any of us see that big picture, knowing how it's all going to fit together? We can. In fact, that's what we generally consider God's providence, because he can. So who knows what is good for man in life? No man knows. And that's the point of it, is that despite the trust that they put in better is the sight of the eyes, wandering of desire, verse 9, the idea of the trust in riches and the trust in the physical nature of things, the desire to be able to control your own destiny, so to speak, all of that effort, you don't know what's good for you. You don't know how it's going to affect you. You think, oh, this is the face value of things, and this is what's going to be good for me, but you don't know that it is. In fact, as Solomon points out, generally, if it's under the sun, it's not necessarily good for you. And that's where perspective comes in. Who can tell of his vain life which he passes like a shadow? There's another reference among all the references in the Bible to man's life that is brief. But I wonder if Solomon here in verse 12, if it's not just the brevity of life that he's referencing regarding a shadow, but what does a shadow not have? Substance. Can you or I, and really, I mean, and this is going to apply to anybody, okay? It doesn't matter how powerful, how much influence, president of the United States, whatever. Is anybody have enough substance for their impression to be made for thousands of years? Does any man have that power beyond what God has allowed to stay recorded, obviously? Solomon describes how that one generation comes, they forget the generation that has come before. And so verse 12, this vain life, which he passes like a shadow. Not only do I think he's dealing with the idea of brevity, but also the idea that man doesn't have any substance that's going to make a lasting impression. Okay, maybe in that first generation, our children, hopefully our grandchildren, they'll maybe be old enough to remember us one day when we pass away. But beyond that, there's not going to be much opportunity for generations beyond to remember us. And that seems to carry with it the idea of being of the ground, of the soil, being Adam. Because the idea of under the sun, this stuff has substance, doesn't it? But in the grand scheme of things, does it? If you throw this thing in a fire, will it burn? Yeah, it'll burn. It'll go away. None of this has substance. Just like man's life under the sun, it's like a shadow. Who can tell a man what will happen after him under the sun? Nobody can. And that goes back to the idea of substance or lack thereof. The lack of a lasting impression beyond our family and immediate family for that matter. No one can tell a man what's going to happen after him. And that goes back to, there are many things that increase vanity. What did the Egyptian pharaohs and many kings in history attempt to do? What was the whole idea of building all of these great, huge statues and pyramids and buildings? Why do you think they did all that? Yeah, to be remembered. Now, even today, we have ideas and theories. We think we know who built what or who was kind of in charge of it. But do we really know? Even the pyramids, we aren't completely sure which pharaoh did what. Yes, there's proof, there's evidence that these individuals were powerful, or at least had the sway over thousands and thousands of people to be able to enact these things. But they're not remembered in that sense. And even then, even though the pyramids have lasted, however many thousands of years that they've been in existence, one day will they finally weather down to nothing? If God lets this world last long enough, yeah, they will.
It's already shown.
Huh?
They already shown where.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's already shown the weathering that's gone down.
Another angle of the shadow is a shadow is an indication of time.
Yeah, that's right.
What time of day it is. And
That's true.
that shadow just
Starts in the morning. And they had sundials, that
right.
yeah, absolutely. That's another layer to that one. So again, these are two rhetorical questions that Solomon asks, which goes back to the point that under the sun, all of this pursuit of vanity means nothing. Nothing you do is going to last immemorial. Who can tell a man what will happen after him? Nobody can. And no matter how hard you try, you're not going to be able to leave that lasting impact. No man really should. And that's really what Solomon's point ends up being. Because is this life about us? Is this life about us? Who should it be about? It should be about God, shouldn't it? That's who it should be about. But the fact of the matter is, so often man wants to make it about themselves. Those in power, those with authority, they want themselves to be remembered, their legacy. But it's never about them, it's about God. Anything through chapter 6, verse 12. All right, chapter 7, verse 1. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. A lot of times we start here in chapter 7, and I think it's a great passage to read for funerals, for people whose loved ones have passed, to remind us of the proper perspective that we need to have. But notice the context, that it's in a much larger context, isn't it? I mean, going all the way back to chapter 4, this concept of death has come up on numerous occasions. But really, the immediate context of chapter 6 is all about the vanity of life under the sun and the attempt to make it more than what it is. It's only dust. That's all it is. So verse 1, a good name is better than precious ointment. Yes, sir?
He's made comparisons up to this chapter, well, all throughout. Usually they're extremes, good versus evil, and very extremes. But this right here is a comparison of something that you would think is good, like precious ointment, versus something you wouldn't imagine to be important. And it may be still extremes, but it's kind of a different twist on this comparison of two things.
Right.
The day of death versus day of birth. When you first look at it, you don't see that until you take the time to think about it. And that's what he's trying to get us to think about, is to think and consider these things deeper than just on the surface. Right.
And the implications of what the importance of that is. When you consider the idea of a good name, what's a good name? What does he mean by a good name? Reputation, right? A good name in a reputation, having that good name carries with it a sense of an example, right? Especially for those who are closest to us, because they know us the best, and they are going to be the ones who take our example to heart the most. The idea of a reputation, especially a reputation that is sealed when? At what point can you no longer ruin a good reputation? Huh? Well, when is it that you can't ruin a good reputation anymore? When you're dead. Okay, you could have spent 30 years building up a good reputation. I mean, recent news and so forth can kind of carry that on the last couple of years. I mean, this has always been going on, but things that come out may or may not have happened and so forth, accusations. All this idea of a reputation that people sometimes work hard to build and to cultivate, and then all of a sudden it can be destroyed in one day. Well, a good name is sealed on the day you die. Keeping that example and that good reputation all the way through to death. That's better than precious ointment. Now, some of the commentaries I read on this, the idea of precious ointment, obviously there was certain types of ointments that were used in death rituals, burials. But I wonder if he might be referencing, I don't know what the tradition was when children were born, if they were anointed with something or if they were cleaned with some kind of ointment or something like that. But I wonder, because that would certainly fit with his concept, the day of death and the day of one's birth. But if we go with the concept that precious ointment is about the burial or death, if this first part of verse 7 or chapter 7 verse 1 is only about death, then precious ointment, we even in the New Testament, remember, I'm trying to remember who it was. Was it Mary Magdalene that was washing the feet of Jesus and was using the valuable ointment? Who? Yeah, the spikenard. And was it Judas who brought up the fact that this is worth so much money, we could sell it and use it? Was it Mary Magdalene who was doing that? It was, wasn't it? I think it was. And Jesus pointed out that she was doing what? What was she doing? Yeah, she understood. There was an element that she understood what was to come. She was anointing him for the day of his death. And there is a sense in which the honor that was being bestowed in that. And I wonder if what Solomon is describing here goes to the actual thought process like Judas had. This is valuable, and that we could use this. We can sell this. The idea of the precious ointment. If Solomon has under consideration the death, the burial process that takes place, does precious ointment do anything for you once you're dead? No, it doesn't do anything for you. But the representation behind that ointment, the honor, the reputation, the understanding of what type of person you were, what type of perspective you had on life, that is what's going to stick around. The precious ointment isn't going to do anything. And so I wonder if he's contrasting the idea of what, kind of like what Doug pointed out, is the idea of what people generally think has substance, but really in fact is only representative of what really does have substance. That reputation, that good example, that good name.
Chapter 6, verse 11, a little bit better.
Yeah, oh absolutely. Yeah, that idea of the vanity and what increases vanity. How is man the better? Is man the better with precious ointment? He may smell a little bit better momentarily, right? But beyond that, it doesn't do anything for him. And so, again, I don't know if this is the day of death and the day of one's birth. Generally speaking, the idea of birth, of springtime, for instance, it's a time of hope, new life, right? The idea of countless possibilities, countless potential. All right, the idea of new birth carries that sense, and the sense of legacy, the sense of kind of leaving a part of yourself behind when you have a child. A part of you lives on, obviously, beyond the spirit, the soul. Part of you lives on physically through that child. And there's a certain element of substance that people place in that. Okay, that's part of the reason why bloodlines were so important for royalty. Genealogies were important to the Jews, because it was all about bloodline. It was all about the physical flesh of the thing. But Solomon says that the day of death is better than the day of one's birth. And that's because why? Why is the death better than the birth? What is it presuming?
He's said in several places, reference the one who's never been born hasn't experienced all this vanity.
All right. And remember the totem pole that we had. You know, the people that were, I guess you could say that he admired the most or were worthy of praise, those that were never born, and then those who are dead, and then at the very bottom, it's those who are still alive. Okay? The day of death and the day of one's birth. Not to say that there isn't hope and that there's countless potential, but at the same time, there's a whole life ahead of facing the reality of existence. And this is what Solomon has under consideration, is man's vanity of placing substance on things that have no substance. And forgetting that which actually does have substance, your character, your perspective, your example. And so the day of your death is better if, certainly if, you have left behind that good name than the day of one's birth, because then you've got this whole experience to have to go through. Now that's a bad thing, but that's what Solomon's observing.
It's a blank plate there, a blank slate.
Right. And it could be written for good or it could be written for bad. But the day of death for one who has a good name, they've gotten through it, haven't they? They've written in their slate, and it's a good slate. Anything through verse 1? Yes, sir.
I don't know, maybe the one is limited to death and birth, but there are other ways that the language used, back in Proverbs 27:9, it's referred to being used in a sense of perfume, it smells good. Medical usage, heavy throughout the Old Testament, even the book of James, called the elders to anoint with oil.
With oil.
Is a measure of trade. So I think more the idea is just the value of the ointment was tremendously important.
Right.
And a lot of it very costly. That adverb is even used in several locations, costly, valuable.
Or expensive ointment, yeah.
So to me, it's a comparison of the value of it. It's even better than whatever you consider valuable. And this is something that they certainly did.
Sure.
Death included, but
Yeah.
there were a bunch of other reasons why this stuff was used. And
Sure.
very pricey.
So, and that would carry over even into new birth. I mean, that's valued, right? I mean, we value new birth. We value children. The idea of a good name that doesn't lack any, it lacks tangible substance, but it has substance that will at least last beyond ointment. And that's kind of the idea there. Anything else through verse 1? Verse 2. Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Notice there's all these better, verse 1, better. And verse 1b, the day of death is better than the day of one's birth. Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. Verse 3, sorrow is better than laughter. Verse 4, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. That's the better place to be. And notice it's all built upon this premise of wisdom versus foolishness. And this is of course, a constant thread that Solomon keeps coming back to. He went back to it in chapter 6, chapter 5, chapter 4. Wisdom versus foolishness. So when he says it's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, is it more fun under the sun to go to the house of feasting? Yeah, from a human perspective, it's more fun to go to the house of feasting. Is it more somber and to a certain extent, from a human perspective, a bit more depressing to go to a funeral? The house of mourning? And I want you to think about that. We use the term funeral, and that's it's an apt term to describe the ceremony. But have you ever heard commonly today the funeral ceremony referred to as the house of mourning, or the funeral home. Have you ever heard anyone refer to the funeral home as the house of mourning? I haven't. I've never heard anyone refer to it as that. Interestingly, funeral home takes any type of emotional element out of it. It's the funeral home. The funeral, that's the name of the thing that we're doing here. It's a service, it's a ceremony, whatever, to remember this loved one. The house of mourning carries with it a sense of people who are crying, people who are emotionally distressed, people who are saddened by the loss of their loved one, who are sad that they won't get to see them anymore under the sun. There's a sense in which verse 2, and of course, I'm sure that's what they referred to it, the house of mourning. They call it a funeral home. But to take a moment and really appreciate what Solomon's describing, not using our terms, which are very clinical to a certain extent, but to look at a funeral home as a house of mourning. In that sense, is it really enjoyable to go to a house where people are crying and wailing and saddened by the loss of a loved one? Is that something you really love to do? I don't think there's anybody who loves to do that. Okay, if it's someone who's close to us, someone who's lost a loved one, a friend, somebody, we want to be there for them. We don't necessarily want to be there amidst all of the sadness, but we want to be there to support them. But this is what Solomon is describing. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to a place where everybody's happy and there's singing and there's feasting and nobody has a care in the world. From a human perspective, every day I would choose to go to the house of feasting. It's depressing going to a house of mourning. But notice what Solomon says. For that, talking about the house of mourning, that is the end of all men. Not so much the funeral home itself. What's the end of all men? Death is. Death is the end of all men. That's what he's referencing. The living will take it to heart. Whether they really like to or not, it's hard to get away at a funeral. It's hard to ignore the implications of what you're observing. No matter how non-religious a person may be, there have been occasions where I've seen the thought process of individuals who weren't particularly religious, but when it came time to go to a loved one's funeral, they were very somber. And it really kind of pricked their mind to think about their mortality. And there is something about that experience that causes people to think more about what they are, or what they aren't, as the case may be. And that's what Solomon is describing. The living will take it to heart, if only in that it pricks their thought process to consider themselves, you know what, I'm not going to live forever either. My great uncle, I'm not sure exactly what the relation, I think he's my great uncle. He passed away about a month and a half ago. He lived in Portland with my grandmother's sister. So whatever that is to me. Great aunt. Okay, there we go. And interestingly enough, I had my uncle text me. He said, "Did you hear about your great uncle?" I said, "Yeah, I heard about it. I mean, he had dementia and he was struggling." I said, "I'm glad he's not dealing with that anymore." But my uncle, who hasn't been particularly religious in his life, over his latter years here, he seems to be warming up a bit to it. But one of the things he talked about, when he texted me, he said, "It really makes you think, one day I'm not going to be here anymore." And I mentioned Ecclesiastes chapter 7. I said, that's why Solomon said, it's better go to the house of mourning, because we remember that this is what we are. And we need to take advantage of the opportunity to do what we can to be prepared for it. But for someone who doesn't have a mind to something religious, times like this break that mirror. It shatters that glass of thinking that everything's going to stay the same, that everything's going to be fun and everything's going to be great, and I won't have a care in the world, so to speak, until all of a sudden a loved one, and a lot of times this is why, and I've seen it many times, where you have someone who was never religious and all of a sudden they get cancer, or they have their spouse or child get very, very sick, or they die. And all of a sudden, they want to learn more. And it's because of this type of scenario that Solomon is describing. Because it makes a person really think about what they are. They are human. Verse 3, sorrow is better than laughter. That's what happens in the house of mourning. Sorrow is there. Laughter is in the house of feasting, but sorrow is better for us. From a human perspective, is that really what you would naturally think? That it's better to have sorrow than laughter? Now, is he saying that we should be sorrowful every day of our life and that's the way it should be? We should always be sorrowful? That's not what he's describing. He's describing these moments that remind us and keep in perspective what our life is all about. But what he's saying is that sorrow is better than laughter, because sorrow, when we're at our most humble, okay, when events humble us and events remind us of what we are, there is a sense of sorrow that comes from that doesn't lie to us. It is our human nature that's speaking in that moment, that you are only flesh and that one day you're going to die. In that moment, a sad countenance, the heart is made better. How is a heart made better by sad countenance? What does he mean by that?
In the long run, when you consider the end of man, make some changes in your life.
Okay, so there's some kind of action that comes from this experience, or at least that's what the thought process, how that goes, right? By a sad countenance, the heart is made better, in that not just thinking about it makes a difference, but actually deciding to change the way I'm living, because one day I'm not going to be here anymore and I'm going to have to deal with that. I'm going to have to deal with the fact that I'm going to die, and if there is a God, I'm going to face judgment, and then what? And so the idea is, by a sad countenance, the sense of change can be brought about. There's a sense of understanding, which is why he comes into wisdom here in verse 4. Because events in life help to teach us really what life is all about. Nolan?
This is a different scenario he's describing here, but would that statement be along the lines of Paul's statement, godly sorrow
Worketh repentance.
As you said, there's an action that
Yeah.
comes as a result.
Right. I mean, it starts with that realization of the pricking of the heart, so to speak. In this case, it's the pricking of the mind, of the heart, to realize really what I am. In the midst of wanting to be enjoying life, all of a sudden I'm reminded that it's not always fun and games, that there's a sense of seriousness to our lives, sense of gravity that needs to be there. And the idea of laughter is kind of the opposite of serious. But this is exactly what Solomon's point is. Sad countenance, the heart is made better. It pricks that heart, and then that heart seeks to change it, or hopefully it will. Anything else through verse 3? So verse 4, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Notice the difference between verse 2 and verse 4. There are two separate concepts here. What's the difference between verse 2 and verse 4? Other than wise and foolish. He doesn't mention wise and foolish earlier. There's something else he mentions. Directly on the heels of verse 3. What is not mentioned in verse 2 that is mentioned in verse 4? Heart. Heart is. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. These are occasions where You find yourself having to go to a funeral, you have to go here, you have to go there. You're there. This is the physical sense in which you're there. What Solomon brings up in verse 4 is the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. Not just that it's the wise use these opportunities to go to the house of mourning. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. What does he mean? The heart of the fool is in the house of laughter or mirth. It's a choice. It's where they want to be. But in verse 2, it would seem as though Solomon is describing a temporary scenario. Okay, funerals don't last forever. You go in, you have the ceremony, you leave. Solomon says it's better to go to the house of mourning because in those moments you're reminded of what life is all about. But then in verse 4, he says, the heart of the wise is in. Continues to think about it, thinks a lot about death. To me, there is a continual reminder that Solomon is pointing out here between the wise and the foolish. The foolish, they don't want to think about it. Even if they go to a funeral, sometimes they're forced to kind of deal with the idea of death. But then as soon as they can get out of there, they're back to their life. And they just kind of push it aside. And the foolish forget the perspective that under the sun, are they vain? Is their life vain? Yeah. But they don't want to think about that. They want to think more about the house of mirth. But Solomon says that the wise don't just go to the house of mourning when those times arise, but their heart is there in that even when they leave, the wisdom that they've gained from that experience stays with them. And they dwell on it. They remind themselves that this will be my end one day. As such, how should this change the way that I live? Anything through verse 4? Verse 5. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases the heart. Verse 5, so he's kind of leaving, he's carrying on this vein of wisdom versus foolishness, but he's leaving behind this sense of death for the time being. He's going to come back to it. But here in verse 5, it's better to hear the rebuke of the wise. So we're talking about three different parties of people. We're talking about an individual who on one hand is hearing the rebuke of a wise person or wise people, telling him maybe something he doesn't want to hear. On the other hand, he's hearing fools sing to him, maybe telling him exactly what he wants to hear. What particular king may come to your mind when you think about that? Jeroboam. Yeah, that was the first one I thought about. Or not Jeroboam, Rehoboam. Right? Rehoboam? I'm sorry. Rehoboam. Solomon's son. Which ultimately his decision to go along with what his friends said to do rather than the wise men of his father said to do ended up splitting the kingdom. Thus we had Israel and Judah. The idea here of verse 5 is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. You would think that would be obvious. But this is why verse 6 is there. For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. So for next week, let's consider what's the punchline here? What's the linchpin, verse 6? What does he mean when he says that the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool? What does that mean in context of this individual who's hearing these individuals on both sides, the wise and the fool? All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick up on next Wednesday. Thank you, everybody.